Welcome, everyone. We'll just wait for everybody to filter in here for a second, and then we'll get started. Okay. Looks like we have everyone on. So welcome to our third Thursday history night. This is brought to you by the Southern Trails chapter. I'm Isabel Lingenfelter, and Doug Hawking runs these third Thursday history nights for the Southern Trails chapter. So just to get us started, a little bit of Zoom etiquette. Keep yourself on mute in the full group unless you want to chime in. This is just so that while we're hearing people talk, we don't get other background noise. It makes it hard for people to hear. So we need to practice muting and unmuting skillfully, and just know that we won't always get it right. I get it wrong all the time, and I'm on Zoom all the time. So also, I just want to point out the chat function. If you have any questions, you can click on the little chat icon and send them out to the full group or just to me. And that's a good way to ask any questions if you don't think you're going to be able to hold on to it until the end when we have Q&A. All right. So with that, I just want to make a plug really quick for membership with the Southern Trails chapter. The Southern Trails chapter is dedicated to studying and preserving a network of early migration trade routes that led through the southwestern states to California. And with membership, you'll get a News from the Plains quarterly publication. It's a fantastic publication. And then the Overland Journal quarterly journal, and the Desert Track Southern Trails chapter journal, which is a really wonderful journal that the Southern Trails chapter puts out and focuses on that area of the United States, if that's what you're interested in. So I will go ahead and put a link in the chat. If you are interested in joining the Southern Trails chapter, you can go right there and join today. So with that, I'll pass it over to Doug. He's going to be talking about next month's topic, and then we'll introduce our speaker.
Okay, count on us being here every month on the third Thursday at 5 o'clock Mountain Time. That's not Mountain Savings Time. That is real Mountain Time like we do in Arizona. Pretty soon here, New Mexico will join us. Right now, California is with us, but go figure. In any event, we do have things planned next month, and let's hope I can do this effectively. Next month, we have got Gerald Annert coming up, and he is famous as the world's living expert on the overland mail along the southern route, particularly in Arizona. And he has recently gotten very interested in the Pima Maricopa Nation and their role in assisting travelers on the trail. Basically, a lot of folks wouldn't have made it without the Pima and Maricopa. They were a haven of safety and supplies in the Arizona desert, and a place to fuel up before you hit those really arid western deserts. So please join us next month. Gerald is an impeccable scholar and will have lots of interesting things to say. And over to you.
Okay, thanks, Doug. So tonight I'd like to introduce Charlie Dodge as our speaker. She is Okta's intern and has been doing a lot of research on Chinese immigration. So she's going to be talking tonight about the Carlin 13 and what they reveal about the treatment of Chinese immigrants in the Western US. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Charlie. You can take it away.
Thank you. Okay, give me a minute to share my screen. Okay. All right. And everybody can see it all right? Okay, cool. So yes, today I'm going to be giving a presentation on the Carlin 13. This is Carlin, Nevada. And just as a quick overview, so who are the Carlin 13? In November 1996, a Chinese cemetery containing 13 graves was accidentally uncovered during private land excavation. These burials and their contents were studied for a couple decades. I want to say about 21 years is what I read. 21 years is what I read. And while they did provide a lot of really great information that I can go over in this presentation, the other side of things was that the constant moving of the deceased was pretty troubling, and there were a lot of calls for a respective reburial, particularly a movement spearheaded by Li Ju Chin of Carlin, Nevada, who is known to citizens of Carlin as Mrs. Chin from Chin's Cafe, which is the local Chinese restaurant. And so thanks to her efforts, the 13 were returned and given a traditional reburial in 2018. And then just this past September, they also built a monument in honor of the 13, which I'll have a picture of at the end of the presentation. Oh, and just on a personal note, I was really interested. I actually discovered this story myself earlier this year when I went to the Octa convention in Elko. And I was on one of the tours, and the woman running the tour, the bus drove past Chin's Cafe, and the woman running the tour said, "Oh, remind me to tell you an interesting story about the woman who owns that restaurant." And so I found her later and I said, "What's the interesting story?" And she told me this crazy story about how they found these burials and everything that they went through to get them returned to Carlin, and everything they learned. And it was really remarkable. And I did go to Chin's Cafe, as you can see in the photos. I didn't really get a chance to talk to Mrs. Chin because she was pretty busy, but it was a really very memorable experience. And that's why I wanted to share the information that I found with you guys today. So to jump right in, why are they important? Well, the main thing is these graves were very well preserved, and so through them, historians and archaeologists were able to study how and why the Chinese migrated to Nevada. Who were the Chinese living in Carlin at the time? How did they live? How did they die? And what funerary practices existed among the Chinese in Nevada at this, turn of the century moment? And they were able to study the transition from traditional rituals to the inclusion and adaptation of more American practices among Chinese settlers in the American West. And we're able to see when and how these traditions and funeral practices were modified, what was retained and what was changed as going forward. And so this is a photo of Chinese railroad workers in Donner Pass. And I'm just going to give a short timeline to set historical context for the moment. So in 1849, the Chinese learn about the discovery of gold in California. Thousands immigrate to the Western US. In 1850s, they travel from mines in California eastward to Nevada in search of more employment or new wealth opportunities. In 1859, the discovery of the Comstock lode brought more Chinese to West Nevada, so they're spreading out from California into Nevada. And then in 1868, the construction of the Central Pacific Railroad begins. And then by the time it's completed in 1869, many of the Chinese workers either returned to California, continued working on other rail lines, but there was a considerable amount that remained in Nevada as railroad maintenance men or construction workers, or just setting up communities. And a lot of Chinese railroad workers settled in Carlin, Nevada for a variety of reasons, including agricultural potential. So the Chinese in Nevada. Carlin, like many northern Nevadan communities, had a Chinatown along the railroad tracks. So there was already kind of a community that had been set up. Chinese settlers from the same families and districts would stick together for mutual aid and protection in a very unfamiliar and often very hostile territory. And in Carlin, merchant community leaders would often assume funeral responsibilities like burial, organizing services, and even transporting bodies to San Francisco or to China, depending on what arrangements had been made. And that was a very significant departure from traditional Chinese practice at the time, which would have had immediate family members being in charge of those responsibilities. But here, since that wasn't really an option, it was more of a community leader thing. Some Chinese in Nevada never intended to return to China, and so they would spend the rest of their lives in the US, and their graves would not be exhumed and they would not be shipped back to their families or wherever they came from. In fact, Chinese cemeteries in Elko, Carlin, Winnemucca, Carson City, Virginia City, and Gold Creek all contain burials and Chinese cemeteries that were never exhumed, that do suggest that the deceased had made a decision to remain in the US, which contrasted to traditional belief at the time. There were a lot of Chinese that that would have wanted to make arrangements to be sent back. And this is just another interesting fact that I learned while I was researching the subject, but apparently in the early 20th century, some Chinese in Elko's public cemetery were exhumed with the intent to be returned to China, but due to political conditions at the time, they were never actually shipped back. And at this point, it's relatively unknown what happened to them. So reasons for staying buried in Nevada and not being exhumed for reburial back in their homeland would include being unmarried. Sometimes these individuals had relatives still living in Nevada. They'd already set up a family there. Sometimes they were simply too poor to participate in existing family or community funerary funds. And what that means is, like I was saying before, how community leaders would assume the responsibilities for organizing burials and funerals. In Chinese tradition back home, what would happen was family would be gifted money to pay for funeral services. But since immediate family wasn't around, those traditions weren't really able to be carried out among the Chinese that were abroad. They would set up these community funds. They would pay dues while they were still alive that would then go towards their services after they had passed, or making arrangements to be sent back home, and etc. Another reason why they may not be exhumed to be sent back would be if they died a very sudden or violent death. And again, those preparations hadn't been made ahead of time. And again, some simply just made the decision to stay in Nevada after death. So Carlin's Chinese residents. Very little is known about the Chinese residents of Carlin. When it comes to information about Chinese settlers, documents like newspapers were very often skewed and distorted due to prejudice at the time, which made it really hard to find a reliable source of information. Stories recorded by the Chinese in Carlin and the nearby Elko, and just honestly in general in America at the time, were very sensationalized due to things like the Chinese Exclusion Act, as you can see from the headlines that I've included here from various newspapers at the time. There was a pretty negative sentiment towards Chinese immigrants. And one example that I found was on June 16th, 1878, the weekly Elko Independent reported the discovery of 2 dead Chinese men in a river 3 miles from Carlin. Local European American officials attributed the murder to tramps, and the anti-Chinese editor of the Independent at the time wrote in the article that the tramps were helping to solve the Chinese problem. So you can see why it might be hard to find reliable information about the Chinese residents in Nevada at the time. So Carlin's Chinese Cemetery. This is where the 13 burials were discovered. And while there's no record of Chinese land ownership or lease of the area in which the cemetery containing the 13 was located, archaeological evidence does suggest that it was in use from before 1900 through about 1924, and that it may have been under an affiliate organization that handled burials. And according to records, a farmer named John W. Pewitt homesteaded the 80-acre cemetery site on October 24th, 1920, and then later recorded it on July 21st, 1923, in accordance with the Homestead Act. And seeing as the last recorded burial was in 1924, which was a year after the land was recorded under the Homestead Act, it's assumed that he must have allowed the land to be continued to be used as a cemetery past the point of his recording it. The graves of the Carlin 13 in this plot of land, formed a single line that roughly went northwest to southeast, with the most recent in the north and the earliest graves located in the south end. These graves are situated on a sloping ridge overlooking Maggie Creek near the edge of the Humboldt River, and I've included this picture is of Maggie Creek, and then there's a map on the other end that shows just kind of the general area that this is situated within Nevada. And according to Chinese feng shui practices at the time, burial locations facing a body of water and with great natural beauty surrounding it were generally favored for burial sites. And so in the case of the Carlin Chinese Cemetery, this would have been satisfied by the creek in front and the mountains behind the burial sites. When it comes to Chinese American funerary practices in Nevada, This is where we start to see that shift from Chinese tradition to incorporating more Western elements. So one thing that kind of triggered this transition was the renewal of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act in 1892. And this renewal, it would include Chinese religious persons in the excluded category. So these qualified Chinese burial personnel were now banned from immigrating to the US. And this scarcity that was caused by this new rule is likely the reason for the fact that a lot of Chinese cemeteries started to stop adhering to these feng shui principles, these traditional principles, when it, things like positioning the bodies in a certain order, with heads to the north and feet to the south, because Chinese Americans would have had to turn to American clergymen to perform these funeral services. And we see this in several cases that can be found in the Elko County Record Office as well. Another difference is that in China, burials would probably occur up to a few weeks after death, but in the US, the deceased were often buried very shortly after death. And in fact, if you look at the records in Elko County at the time, up to 94% of Chinese individuals that died in Elko County were buried within 2 days after their death. In Carlin, something interesting about the deceased is that 5 of the 13 had American articles of clothing. So things like belts, Levi pants, and cufflinks, in addition to their traditional Chinese clothing. And another difference, like I mentioned before, is that instead of traditional gifts of funerary money that would have been presented to the families in white envelopes to pay for the funerals, expenses were often paid by the deceased and by community members through dues or district association. And the modifications that we see being made to traditional Chinese burial practices does indicate an increasing adaptation to these rituals that were very important to the Chinese, and especially to the Chinese that were abroad. And here is a map of the Chinese cemetery, and you can see they're numbered beginning with burial 2 going to 13. The reason why it starts with burial 2 is that burial 1 was the ground around burial 1 was disrupted, and it's very unknown where exactly it would have been placed at the time, so that's why it's kind of not part of this layout. So in 1997, a team of anthropologists from the Smithsonian Institution, headed by Douglas Owsley, performed a skeletal analysis of the 13 burial sites. This was the first such data ever collected on Chinese Americans at the turn of the 20th century, so it was pretty significant. And among the information that they found includes the fact that the deceased ranged in age from their 20s to their 60s. Burial 2 was a mummified man between his 20s and his 30s. He had lightish brown hair, which implied that he worked outdoors a lot because it would have been bleached by the sun. And the mummification was likely caused by ground conditions. It wasn't an intentional thing. It was more of a natural process that just happened to this particular burial site. And he had very high mercury levels found in his body, which suggested that he was either a miner or could have possibly been attempting to cure a disease using mercury, which was pretty common at the time. Burial 8 had facial features that indicated that he may have been of mixed ancestry. He was 30 to 39 years old, and he had suffered trauma indicative of a violent death. And we see this in burial 10 as well. Burial 10 also had evidence of trauma that would have led to a violent death. And both burials 8 and 10 contained no provided burial goods in their sites. Burial 12 had been very badly vandalized. 7 of the deceased had their heads oriented towards the north, and 4, possibly 5, were oriented to the south. And this inconsistency, like I mentioned before, was likely due to a European American mortician being involved with some of the burials instead of a Chinese American who would have understood the traditional principles and practices. And so trauma to the skeleton was identified in burials 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, and 13, but all had healed prior to their death. 8 and 10 were the only ones that seemed to have suffered from violent deaths, with burial 8's clavicle, sternum, and several ribs being broken, with the injuries being consistent with hits, kicks, and stomping. He was likely beaten. And burial 10 appeared to have died from blows to the head and chest. And this kind of violence was not uncommon at the time, especially towards Chinese immigrants. So yeah. One thing that's interesting is that we can look at their hairstyles as a way to kind of identify when they may have been alive and when they may have died. So for example, burial 2 had hair with black cordage braided into it to extend it by about 65 centimeters. And burials 1, 5, 6, and 7 also had pretty short hair with false cues. Cues are these braids that you see in the photos that I have. And so they had false cues made of black cord or, black cloth material, either placed beneath or attached directly to their heads. And these cues suggest that the burials occurred prior to the 1911 Chinese Revolution, as they would no longer have been enforced after that point. Cues were enforced in China starting around 1644. Those who did not have a cue in China were often subject to punishment and even death. So Chinese people that immigrated to America, who intended to eventually return to China at some point, would not have wanted to cut their hair, because had they returned to China while these rules were in place, with short hair, they would have been punished for it. And after the revolution, Chinese men would cut their hair, and those in America would adopt Western hairstyles pretty often. Clothing was another way that we were able to see what was going on in the time period that these men were alive and when they died. The clothing found in the deceased marked the transition to American style, to include American styles of clothing. Based on photographs of Chinese men in Nevada in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, a combination of Chinese and Western style clothing was pretty common. In an isolated community like Carlin, where there weren't very many specialized Chinese clothing stores, ready-made American clothing was much more practical for everyday wear. Interestingly enough, burials 1 through 7, which were the earlier graves, appeared to contain a higher percentage of Chinese style clothing than the rest. So this would include traditional footwear and round metal buttons that would have been found on their jackets and things. Most of the graves contained traditional Chinese shoes, which was likely because this kind of footwear would have been more comfortable and more preferable to these men at the time, in comparison to American work boots, which were a little more harsh. And burial 7 was wearing a traditional black Chinese jacket, which you can see in a couple of the photographs I have here, examples of what that may have looked like. And these tables are just a summary of the burial data that was collected when the site was excavated. So you can see the notes that were jotted down, notes about their hair, about their clothing, what was included in the contents of the grave, even their dental conditions, which is pretty interesting. So who were these 13 men? It's unfortunately, information about the deaths of the Carlin Chinese is pretty difficult to pin down. European American deaths were published pretty regularly in local newspapers, but when it comes to Chinese residents, they were very rarely acknowledged, unless something very unusual happened, like a very violent murder or an accident. But through analysis and the discovery of some identification bricks by the grave sites, here's what we do know about the identities of the Carlin 13. We do have the names of several of the 13. Unfortunately, we don't know the identities of all 13, but we do know 11, 12, 6 or 7, 3, 10, and 13. We know their identities. And the reason why it says 6 or 7 is because the identification brick that was found by those burial sites was not found specifically in one or the other. It was kind of in the general area. So it's hard to pinpoint which grave that may have belonged to. And this is an example of one of those identification bricks. This would have been for burial 11. And you can see the 2 top horizontal lines describe where he came from. The right line says the date of his death. It's a little unclear. It looks like it says maybe May 15th. The center line would have been his name, and then the left line would have been his age. So while we unfortunately cannot yet identify all 13 of these individuals, they still were able to provide a really, really remarkable amount of information about the lives and deaths of Chinese settlers in Nevada, in Carlin, Nevada specifically. And they were able to provide a lot of information about the transition from traditional Chinese funeral practices to Western, to start including those Western elements, which was something that was happening more and more often at the time. And as for the current whereabouts of the 13, thanks to the efforts of Li Ju Chin of Chin's Cafe, they were reburied in Carlin in 2018. They were given a traditional funeral ceremony, and you can find videos of this ceremony online if you look it up on YouTube. And here are some photos of the ceremony. And like I said in the beginning, in September 2021, Carlin did dedicate a monument in honor of the 13. And for this presentation, the sources that I used were these two books that I highly, highly recommend if you're interested in at all in anything that I've talked about in this presentation. They're really, really great reads. The first one is Chinese American Death Rituals, and the second is The Chinese in Nevada. And the author, I think, is in the Zoom call. So yeah, if anybody has any questions, I can do my best to answer. I can't wait. I just realized I probably can't see if people are like asking things. If anybody has any questions, like let me know and I can answer. Otherwise.
And if you want to stop sharing your screen, we can go back to,
Yeah.
There we go, yeah. Yeah, and if everyone wants to put yourselves in gallery view, you can go to the top right-hand corner of your screen and change the view to gallery. And then it'll be kind of like we're all in a room together having a conversation. It feels a little bit more like that in gallery view. So yeah, any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and just ask them. I didn't see any come through in the chat.
Well, I'm thinking back to the time that I spent on Taiwan and the various funerals that I saw there, laying out the food. We put that out for the ghosts, and the steam and the odor goes up and the ghosts consume it, and then we eat. So nothing's wasted. Is that about what you know, Charlie?
Honestly, I have not attended a funeral, a contemporary funeral in China, but that sounds about right from what I have read.
So did you do all of this after the convention in Elko?
Yeah, so I heard about the story in Elko, and then I actually did correspond with Professor Su Fan Chung, who I think is here, and she provided me with a lot of really, really great articles, and I also read her books, and so I did all the research after coming back. But I really those were like my main sources. I really drew from the research that she had done.
It was really interesting because I know when we were on the bus tour, we just were taken to like the Chinese gardens. It's like, well, what are we supposed to see here? It was just like a park, and I didn't understand why we were stopping there. So how close are those to the graves? I would think kind of far.
I think, yeah, the graves were closer to like the Maggie Creek Basin, which I don't think was right around where we were. But I think the monument that they installed in September is close to the Chinese gardens.
Oh, okay.
I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
I believe
Cool.
that that's where it is.
Very
I was a little disappointed when I came back because I didn't know that they had made a monument, and so if I had known, I would have tried to go take a picture of it myself.
Right. That would have been fun. Good way to
Yeah.
end your project.
Right.
Good job. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I really enjoyed doing research on this. It was like a really, really fantastic, remarkable story. And I really, like I said before, I really recommend reading those two books that I listed as my sources. All the information that I got were from a few chapters in those books. There's so much more, to learn about the Chinese immigrants at the time, and this transition from Chinese culture to adapting to Western culture and including Western culture. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, I remember my research 40 odd years ago found such horrible things like the California Constitution of 1879, I think it's 1879, made it a duty of city officials to see that all Chinese were outside the city by dusk or inside a regular Chinatown that had a locked gate. Yeah.
Yeah, the amount of the amount of laws that very specifically were created to target Chinese immigrants is kind of crazy when you start to look into it. Like if you remember when I was talking about the braids, the cues
Right.
that the men had, there was this law that was created. I don't know off the top of my head exactly what year, but it was called the Pigtail Ordinance. And it basically what the law said was any criminal, anybody who was arrested would have had their hair cut within an inch of their head. And it was very clearly targeting Chinese individuals because they would have had hair longer than, an inch away from their scalp. And I guess people at the time thought that the Chinese were intentionally committing crimes so that they could live in the prisons and get free meals and things like that. And so they created this law that targeted them to try to discourage them from being criminals. But it was actually overturned in a court case, I believe. It was a Chinese individual, a Chinese man got arrested, and then he sued because he said that he was being targeted, and he won. And so the law was overturned.
Well, he's indeed lucky that he won, because
Yeah.
there was one court case where a Black man had murdered a Chinese, and all the witnesses were Chinese, and it was, they saw it happen, and they went into court. And at that point, the court said that since the Chinese were Buddhists and not Christians, they couldn't take an oath on a Bible in court, and therefore could not give testimony. And they were not allowed to give testimony against a white man. And we had the new Civil Rights Acts that had gone in at the end of the Civil War. And they said, yep, and under that, Black people are included too. So the guy got off with murder.
Yeah, it's pretty nuts. There's a lot of really interesting history about the Chinese in America at the turn of the century. And I feel like it's one of those, like, it's a very untapped well of history. I don't see a lot of stories about it generally. So I'm glad that people are interested.
Yeah.
I thought it was fascinating to see the contrast between the Carlin burials originally, and then the kind of present day reburial, and how
Yeah.
they were treated. I was wondering, is it still common for Chinese immigrants to seek to or make arrangements to be buried back in China today? Do you know if
I
that's
don't know off the top of my head. But yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. I would say it probably depends on how much family they have here versus back home. Because I think that just in general, for anybody who's moving internationally, that's probably one of the things to take into consideration. But yeah, and I mean, all of the reburial, all of that is, we have Mrs. Chin to thank, because she really spearheaded that effort. She was really trying hard to get them to be returned. I mean, from what I read, they had been kind of passed around from lab to lab, and they'd been studied for like over 20 years, and they eventually ended up in, I don't know, some basement lab in some university. And so it's a good thing that she got them returned, so they're not still just sitting somewhere. The same thing didn't just happen to them that happened to those exhumed burials from Elko that were never returned.
Do you know how long she worked on that?
I mean, I know that it was like 21 years from the moment they were exhumed to when they were eventually reburied, and I think for a majority of that time she was trying to get them returned.
Wow, that's tenacious.
Yeah, she was really nice. I got to talk to her for like a very short while when I went to the restaurant, and she won an award. She has a plaque commemorating her for getting all of this done, and she has it in her restaurant. Yeah.
Did anyone else have any other questions for Charlie?
I don't have a question. I'm Charlie's fourth grade teacher. I'm so proud of everything you've done tonight. We always try to instill that you want to be lifelong learners. Charlie's on a good path towards that. I'm just extremely proud of the research you did, the information you gave us tonight. It was just top notch, just like you were in fourth grade, but your old teacher is very, very proud of you tonight. Great job. Great
Thank
job.
you. Thank you. And thank you for coming.
My pleasure.
Jenny, I see that you had a question. Go on ahead and unmute yourself. It's in the lower left-hand corner of your screen if you roll over.
Oh, I just was saying I have to go, but I think it's great what Charlie did. And yay, go fourth grade teachers, because that's what I used to teach too. And I'm glad when people still love history and keep learning more about it. So I'm going to send you a couple of emails, maybe, Charlie. I'm going to find some books I think you'd be interested in as well.
Oh yeah, fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
So I'll find them and get them off to you in a bit. So
Thank you.
got to go. So I'll see you guys later. Nice job.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Doug, would you still like to do the questions that I was thinking about asking folks tonight?
Okay, and I do want to be sure we thank Charlie for doing this for us. It's been very, very good.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to talk. It was really, really cool putting the presentation together. I've been really excited to do this for a while. So.
Okay, and are you at Stony Brook?
Oh no, I'm at NYU, which is why I'm in a dorm room right now.
Okay, well, I knew you were in New York. I thought you said once that you were SUNY Stony Brook.
No, I'm in NYU. My dorm's in like the middle of Union Square, so I'm honestly glad that it's not too noisy. We usually get a couple hundred sirens a day, so.
Okay, let me see if I can locate those questions real quick. Oh boy. All right. If you've attended a Southern Trail Zoom talk before, what did you like about it? What might you change? If you haven't, what have you liked about other historic talks you've attended? So if any of you'd like to discuss this, I know David's attended before. It's hard to get him to speak up. Anyone?
Looks like he unmuted himself.
Oh, good.
Oh,
And
no,
then
back
muted
on
himself
mute.
again. David, please unmute yourself and provide us with wisdom.
I mean, I can just say, oh, sorry. Oh my gosh, sorry. I didn't realize David was going to say.
Oh, it was an excellent presentation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I was going to say, I mean, this is kind of the first time that I've been attending the Southern Trails presentations myself, but from what I saw at the convention in Elko at those talks, there definitely seems to be a big interest in more like these new kind of diverse stories that haven't been told before. Some of the talks in Elko included, there was a Native American woman who talked about her family, her ancestors' first interactions with white settlers, which was really fascinating. There was another professor who gave a talk about a Native American activist in, I believe, the 19th century that was kind of like one of the first activists to kind of speak out against the treatment of Native Americans at the time. And you could totally tell sitting in the auditorium that there was this hunger for all of this new information. So that's why, I mean, thank you for inviting me to give this presentation, because I feel like there's definitely interest in these subjects.
Are there any topics you'd like to see us address in the future? Well,
It's okay, we got a shy group tonight.
yeah, well, it's kind of typical, and folks are kind of afraid to speak up when they haven't done it before. I can see we probably got a couple of people besides your fourth grade teacher that are specifically here for Charlie, and that's nice. And I only see a couple of names from Southern Trails chapter that I recognize from previous. So how many names do you recognize, Charlie?
Quite a few. In addition to my fourth grade teacher, one of my high school teachers is actually here too. Which thank you, Mr. Smith. I appreciate you coming. As well as my roommate and my mother and my aunt. So I really
Okay.
appreciate you guys all coming. This is really nice.
Okay. Well, Isabel, that explains some of the silence on Southern Trail questions.
Yep.
I have probably got to work harder at getting the word out and getting our board especially to invite people and come themselves.
We'll have to get into more of a routine.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you again, Charlie. This was really great. We recorded the talk. We'll get it up on Okta's YouTube channel, and I'll send that out to everyone. So
Thank you.
Okay.
And
Good
thank
evening.
you
And
to
thanks for
everybody that came.
thanks, everyone.